My family called me the invisible sister, until my secret identity lit up Times Square and turned my sister's engagement dinner upside down. They called me the invisible daughter, the quiet one, the sister who would never be enough. For 27 years, I believed them until the night my face appeared on a Times Square billboard and my family's carefully constructed world shattered like glass. Turns out, while they were busy telling me I didn't matter, I was building an empire they never saw coming. My name is Elvance, but the fashion world knows me as Ivy Vale. And this is the story of how the girl they overlooked became the woman they couldn't ignore, and how sometimes the most devastating revenge is simply refusing to stay small. I remember the exact moment I realized I was invisible. I was 12 years old, standing in our living room during one of Mom's dinner parties, watching Colette hold court like a tiny queen. She had this way of tilting her head when she laughed that made every adult in the room lean forward, desperate to catch whatever golden words might fall from her lips next. "Colette is going to be such a heartbreaker," Mrs. Patterson from next door had gushed, ruffling my sister's perfectly curled blonde hair. And then she looked at me, searching for something kind to say about the awkward girl with mousy brown hair and two big front teeth. "Elle is so quiet." That word became my label. Quiet, which really meant forgettable, unremarkable, plain. Mom, Vivian to her friends, always Vivian, never just Mom, would nod along with these assessments, her smile tight and apologetic as if she were personally sorry for producing such an ordinary second daughter. Colette was 3 years older than me, and from the time I could form memories, she was the sun around which our family orbited. At family gatherings, relatives would coo over her latest school play performance, her straight A's, or the way she could charm any adult into giving her exactly what she wanted. I learned early to fade into the background, to become part of the wallpaper, because any attempt to share in the spotlight only resulted in subtle corrections. "Well, honey, maybe let your sister finish her story first," Vivian would say whenever I tried to contribute to conversations, or worse, "That's nice, dear," in that tone that meant she wasn't really listening at all. The worst part wasn't even the neglect, it was watching Colette soak up every drop of attention like she was entitled to it, like there was a finite amount of love in the world and she deserved to hoard it all. She never seemed to notice how I would shrink back whenever she entered a room or how I would automatically step aside when photographers wanted family pictures, knowing instinctively that I would ruin the composition. By the time I was 16, I had perfected the art of being invisible. I dressed in muted colors, spoke only when spoken to, and spent most of my time reading in my bedroom while Colette practiced her pageant walks in the hallway. The few times I tried to break out of my shell, joining the school newspaper, auditioning for the spring musical, Colette would find ways to remind me of my place. "Elle's trying out for the lead role," she'd announced at dinner one night, her voice dripping with false encouragement. I think it's so brave when people reach for things that are beyond their natural abilities. I didn't get the part. I stopped auditioning for things after that. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday in October, delivered by courier in a cream-colored envelope with Colette's initials embossed in gold. Even her engagement announcements had to be theatrical. I stared at the elegant script requesting my presence at an intimate dinner celebration at the Rosewood Hotel, one of those places where the appetizers cost more than most people's grocery budgets. Part of me wondered if it was a mistake. Colette and I hadn't spoken in months, not since the awkward phone call where she'd informed me she was engaged to Sebastian Morrison, heir to some tech fortune I'd never bothered to research. She'd made it clear during that conversation that she was expecting a certain level of enthusiasm from me, the kind of squealing sister excitement that I'd never been capable of providing. "You could at least pretend to be happy for me," she'd said when I'd offered a simple congratulations. "I am happy for you," I'd replied, though we both knew it wasn't entirely true. It was hard to be happy for someone who had spent your entire childhood making you feel like you were taking up too much space in the world. Now, holding the invitation, I felt that familiar knot in my stomach that came with any family obligation. The smart thing would be to send regrets, to claim I was traveling for work or coming down with something. But Nova, my roommate and closest friend, had other ideas. "You're going," she announced when she found me staring at the invitation over my morning coffee. Nova Bennett was everything I wasn't: bold, confident, unapologetically herself. She'd swooped into my life 3 years ago when we'd both answered an ad for a 2-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn, And somehow she decided that my quiet, careful existence needed her particular brand of fierce friendship. I really don't think I should, I said. But Nova was already shaking her head. Elle, you've spent your entire life letting that family make you feel small. Maybe it's time to show them who you've become. Who I'd become was complicated, because the person I'd become was someone none of them knew existed. For the past 5 years, I'd been living a double life that would have shocked anyone who knew the quiet, unremarkable Elvance. To the fashion world, I was Ivy Vale, a name I'd chosen carefully, something that sounded both strong and graceful, something that belonged to a woman who deserved to be seen. It had started almost by accident. I'd been working as an assistant at a small modeling agency, filing papers and fetching coffee, when one of their photographers needed a last-minute replacement for a catalog shoot because the model had cancelled. They were desperate, and I happened to be the right size for the clothes. I'd expected to feel awkward and exposed under the lights, but something magical happened instead. The camera saw something in me that mirrors never had. One shoot led to another, then another, always under the name Ivy Vale, always with the understanding that my real identity would remain private. I wasn't trying to be mysterious, I was trying to be safe, safe from my family's judgment, safe from their ability to diminish something that finally made me feel valuable. The modeling led to creative direction, to styling, to consulting on campaigns for brands that valued subtlety over spectacle. I was good at it, better than good. I had an eye for finding beauty in unexpected places, for showcasing the kind of quiet elegance that got overlooked in favor of flashier alternatives. It was exactly the opposite of everything Colette represented, and maybe that's why I was so passionate about it. 3 weeks ago, Vogue had approached me about being the face of their new campaign celebrating unconventional beauty. The spread would reveal my identity for the first time, connecting Ivy Vale to Elvance in a way that would make hiding impossible. I'd said yes, knowing it would change everything, but I hadn't expected the magazine to be released quite so soon. Now, sitting with Colette's invitation in my hands, I realized that fate might be forcing my hand. The timing felt too coincidental to ignore. If you're going to go, Nova said, settling into the chair across from me, you need to look like the woman you are, not the girl they remember. That evening, Nova helped me choose an outfit, a simple black dress that somehow managed to be both understated and striking. It was the kind of dress that would have seemed too sophisticated for the old Elle, too confident. But as I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw Ivy Vale looking back, the woman who posed for photographers without flinching, who gave creative direction to teams of artists, who had built a career on her own terms. They're not going to recognize you, Nova said, and I could hear both excitement and worry in her voice. She was right. The years had been kind to me in ways that adolescence never was. I'd learned how to dress for my body, how to carry myself with purpose, how to make my quietness feel intentional rather than apologetic. My hair was longer now, a rich chestnut brown that caught the light in ways that Mousy had never managed. I'd grown into my features, discovering that what had seemed plain in a 16-year-old face looked elegant and refined in a woman's. But more than the physical changes, there was something different in my eyes, a confidence that came from knowing I was good at something, from having built a life that belonged entirely to me. It was the kind of confidence that couldn't be borrowed or faked because it came from actually achieving something worth being confident about. The night before the dinner, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the last time I'd seen most of these people at Colette's college graduation party. I'd been 21 then, still unsure of myself, still automatically deferring to everyone else's opinions about who I should be. I'd worn a pale pink dress that had washed me out completely, and I'd spent the entire evening helping in the kitchen because it gave me an excuse to avoid making conversation. I remembered the way Colette's friends had looked through me as if I were part of the furniture. I remembered overhearing one of them ask Colette, "Is that your sister? She seems so different from you," and Colette's response, "Elle's always been the quiet one. She's not really comfortable in social situations." Not comfortable, as if my discomfort was a personality trait rather than a learned response to years of being treated like I didn't quite belong in my own family. But tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, I would walk into that room as Ivy Vale, even if they only saw Elvance. I would carry myself like a woman who had appeared on magazine covers, who had directed photo shoots, who had built something meaningful with her own hands. I would be quiet if I chose to be quiet, not because someone else had decided that's all I was capable of being. I scrolled through Colette's Instagram before bed, a habit I'd never quite been able to break. Her feed was exactly what I'd expected: perfectly curated shots of her engagement ring, artfully arranged breakfast spreads, mirror selfies that showed off designer outfits. Everything was beautiful and polished and somehow completely hollow. But in a few of the photos, especially the ones where she was caught off guard, I could see something underneath the performance, a tightness around her eyes, a forced quality to her smile. It made me wonder if all that attention she'd craved had turned out to be as fulfilling as she'd expected, or if she'd discovered what I'd always suspected, that performing happiness was exhausting, and that being seen wasn't the same thing as being known. The Rosewood Hotel was exactly the kind of place Colette would choose, all marble and crystal, and the sort of understated luxury that whispered rather than shouted about money. I stood in the lobby for a moment, watching well-dressed people glide past like they'd been born knowing how to navigate spaces like this, and felt that old familiar flutter of not quite belonging. But then I caught sight of myself in one of the mirrored columns, and the woman looking back wasn't the uncertain girl who used to shrink in fancy places. She was Ivy Vale, who had been photographed in locations far more intimidating than this. I straightened my shoulders and walked toward the private dining room like I owned the place. The double doors opened to reveal 20-some people arranged around an elegant table that probably cost more than most people's cars. Everyone looked up as I entered, and I watched their faces cycle through confusion, recognition, and something that looked almost like surprise. They knew me, but they were clearly struggling to reconcile this version of Elle with their memories. Colette's voice carried across the room, pitched at exactly the right level to sound welcoming while somehow making it clear that my arrival was unexpected. She rose from her seat at the head of the table, resplendent in a cream-colored dress that probably had a designer label I was supposed to recognize. "You actually came." The emphasis on actually wasn't lost on anyone in the room. It was Colette's way of reminding everyone that I was the family member who usually didn't show up, the one who couldn't be counted on to participate in important moments, never mind that I'd rarely been invited to important moments. "Of course I came," I said, accepting her air kiss and trying not to flinch when her perfectly manicured nails pressed briefly into my arms. "I wouldn't miss your engagement dinner." Sebastian Morrison rose from beside her, and I got my first good look at my sister's fiancé. He was handsome in that clean-cut, expensive way that came from good genetics and better skin care, but there was something thoughtful in his expression that seemed at odds with the flashy celebration. When he shook my hand, his grip lingered just a moment longer than necessary. "You must be Elle," he said, and there was something in his voice, curiosity, maybe, or recognition. "Colette told me so much about you." I wondered what exactly she'd told him, probably the usual narrative: sweet but unremarkable little sister, never quite managed to find herself, works in something vague and creative. The story Colette told about me had never borne much resemblance to reality, but it was the version our family preferred. They seated me at the far end of the table between Cousin Harper, who I remembered as Colette's shadow during family gatherings, and Great Aunt Ruth, who was already 3 glasses deep into the wine and loudly critiquing the flower arrangements. It was the kind of placement that made it clear I was an afterthought, someone they'd had to find room for at the last minute. Colette dominated the conversation, as expected. She held court from her position at the head of the table, regaling everyone with stories about wedding dress shopping, venue hunting, and the complexities of planning a destination engagement party in the Hamptons. Every anecdote was perfectly crafted to showcase her refined taste and Sebastian's generous resources. "We're thinking Tuscany for the honeymoon," she was saying, gesturing with her wine glass for emphasis. "Sebastian knows someone who has a villa there, private, completely exclusive, the kind of place you can't just book, you have to know people." I found myself watching Sebastian during these performances, curious about his reactions. He smiled and nodded at appropriate moments, but there was something distant in his expression, as if he were observing the scene rather than fully participating in it. Once or twice, I caught him looking in my direction with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Elle's never been to Europe," Colette announced suddenly, and I realized she must have noticed me watching her fiancé. "She's not much of a traveler. Prefers staying close to home, don't you, Elle?" It was a perfect example of how Colette operated, taking a grain of truth and shaping it into something that diminished me. Yes, I hadn't traveled extensively, but that was because I'd been building a career, not because I lacked adventure or curiosity. I'd simply chosen to invest my time and energy differently than she had. "I've been focused on work," I said simply. But even that mild response seemed to irritate her. "Oh, Elle's always been so serious about her little projects," she said with a laugh that invited everyone else to share in the joke. "Remember when you wanted to be a photographer? What was it you used to say? You were going to capture the beauty that nobody else could see." The memory she was referencing was from when I was 15, when I had saved up for months to buy a second-hand camera and had spent every weekend taking pictures around the city. The photos had been good enough that my art teacher had suggested I apply to specialized programs. But when I'd shown them to the family, Colette had dismissed them as weird and depressing, and Mom had worried that focusing too much on art would make me even more antisocial than I already was. "I remember," I said, and there must have been something in my voice because Harper looked at me with sudden interest. "Elle always had such a good eye," Harper said unexpectedly. "I remember those pictures you took of me at the beach house that summer. I still have them." I looked at her in surprise. Harper had been Colette's devoted follower for as long as I could remember, someone who laughed at all the right moments and agreed with everything my sister said. I'd never imagined she'd kept anything I'd created. "That's sweet," Colette said, but her smile had tightened. She didn't like when attention drifted away from her, even briefly. Elle always was creative. Maybe she still does her little hobby projects. Little hobby projects, as if the campaigns I directed hadn't been featured in major publications, as if the work I'd done hadn't been praised by some of the most respected names in fashion. But I couldn't say any of that without revealing who I really was, and I wasn't ready for that conversation yet. My phone buzzed with a text from Nova. "Your Vogue cover dropped. You're everywhere now, even Times Square." I excused myself to the restroom, needing a moment to process what Nova had just told me. The campaign was live, which meant that right now, all over the city, people were seeing Ivy Vale's face on billboards, bus stops, and magazine covers. The secret I'd been keeping for 5 years was about to become impossible to maintain. Standing in the marble bathroom, I stared at my reflection and tried to imagine what would happen when my two worlds collided. Would Colette be proud that her quiet sister had achieved something significant? Or would she find a way to diminish it, to make it about her somehow? I thought about my father, who had died when I was 22, just as I was starting to figure out who I wanted to be. He'd been the only person in the family who had ever seemed to really see me, who had encouraged my photography and listened to my ideas without immediately comparing them to Colette's more conventional achievements. "Don't disappear," he told me during one of our last conversations when I'd been struggling with whether to pursue art school or choose something more practical. "The world has enough people trying to be like everyone else. It needs more people who are brave enough to be themselves." I'd carried those words with me through every photo shoot, every creative decision, every moment when I'd been tempted to play it safe instead of trusting my instincts. "Don't disappear" had become my personal motto, even when, especially when, my family had made it clear that disappearing was exactly what they expected from me. When I returned to the table, Harper leaned toward me conspiratorially. "You look amazing tonight," she said quietly. "Different, confident. I don't know what you've been doing, but it's working." It was the first genuine compliment I'd received from anyone in my family in years, and it caught me off guard. Harper had always been beautiful in that conventional way that got rewarded in our family: blonde, bubbly, easy to understand. But there was something in her expression now that suggested she'd been watching more carefully than I'd realized. "Thank you," I said, and meant it. "I always wondered what happened to that girl who took those incredible pictures," she continued. "I hoped you didn't give up on that part of yourself." Before I could respond, Julian Crawford appeared at my elbow. Julian had been Colette's high school boyfriend, the kind of golden boy who had seemed destined for greatness. Now he was married with kids and working in finance, still handsome but softer around the edges in the way that came with suburban contentment. "Elvance," he said with a smile that seemed genuinely pleased. "I was hoping you'd be here tonight." I tried to hide my surprise. Julian had barely acknowledged my existence when he'd been dating my sister, treating me with the same polite indifference that most of Colette's friends had shown. "Julian," I said. "It's good to see you. You know, I always wondered what happened to you after high school," he said. "You were so talented, so, I don't know, different from everyone else." "In a good way," he added quickly. The conversation was surreal. This was the same person who had sat at our kitchen table dozens of times without ever asking me a single question about myself, who had treated me like part of the furniture. Now he was talking to me like I was someone worth knowing. "I heard you're in the city now, working in fashion or something." "Something like that," I said carefully. From across the table, I caught Vivian watching our conversation with a frown. My mother had mastered the art of reading social dynamics, and she could sense when attention was flowing in directions she didn't approve of. She caught my eye and gave me a look that clearly said I should wrap up whatever inappropriate flirtation she imagined was happening. It was exactly the kind of subtle control that had shaped my entire childhood, the raised eyebrow that meant I was speaking too loudly, the slight headshake that meant I was being too enthusiastic, the careful redirection that ensured I never held center stage for too long. Even now, at 27 years old, I felt the automatic impulse to comply. But then I remembered Nova's text and the billboard in Times Square and the fact that somewhere in the city, people were looking at my face and seeing something worth their attention. I smiled at Julian and continued our conversation. "You know," he said, lowering his voice slightly, "I always had a bit of a crush on you back then. You probably didn't know. I was too caught up in trying to impress your sister. But there was something about you that was so genuine, real." I stared at him in shock. Julian Crawford had had a crush on me, the boy I'd watched from afar, thinking he was completely out of my league, had been thinking about me too. "I never knew," I said honestly. "I was an idiot teenager," he said with a laugh, too scared to tell the interesting girl how I felt, too focused on what other people expected me to want. Story of adolescence, right? As dessert was being served, Sebastian rose from his seat at the head of the table. Everyone quieted, expecting the traditional engagement toast. But instead of launching into the usual speech about love and commitment, he looked directly at me. "You know," he said, and his voice carried clearly across the room, "you really remind me of someone. There's something so familiar about you." I felt every eye in the room turn toward me, and my heart started beating faster. This was it, the moment I'd been both dreading and anticipating all evening. Sebastian pulled out his phone, and I watched him scroll through what looked like a news app. Then he held up the screen, and I saw my own face looking back at me from the Vogue cover story that had just gone live. "I think," he said with a slow smile, "this might be you." The silence that followed Sebastian's words was the kind that seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the room. 20-some pairs of eyes stared at the phone screen, then at me, then back at the screen, as if they were trying to solve a puzzle that didn't quite make sense. The image on Sebastian's phone was unmistakably me, not the carefully understated version sitting at their dinner table, but me as Ivy Vale, photographed for Vogue's unconventional beauty campaign. In the photo, I was looking directly into the camera with an expression of quiet confidence, wearing a flowing white dress that seemed to glow against the natural lighting. The headline read, "Meet Ivy Vale, the anonymous model finally reveals her identity." "Wait," Harper was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. That's actually you." I could feel my pulse racing, but strangely, I didn't feel the panic I'd expected. Instead, there was something almost liberating about having the secret finally out in the open. I nodded slowly. "Yes," I said simply. "That's me." The words seemed to break some kind of spell, and suddenly everyone was talking at once. Voices overlapped as people pulled out their own phones, frantically searching for the story that was apparently spreading across social media faster than they could process. "But you were," Aunt Ruth fumbled for words, her wine-flushed face creased with confusion. "Plain," someone else finished. "She was never plain," Harper said firmly, and her unexpected defense made several people turn to look at her. "We just never really looked at her." Colette had gone completely still, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth, a piece of chocolate cake balanced precariously on the end. Her face had gone pale except for two bright spots of color on her cheeks. She looked like someone had just told her that gravity had stopped working. "This is ridiculous," she said finally, setting down her fork with deliberate care. "Elle, what is this? Some kind of joke?" But even as she said it, more people were finding the story on their phones, reading aloud pieces of the article that detailed Ivy Vale's 5-year career in fashion, her work as a creative director, the campaigns she'd been part of that had quietly influenced trends across the industry. "Ivy Vale has been fashion's best-kept secret," Uncle Robert read from his phone, his voice filled with amazement. "Her eye for unconventional beauty has shaped some of the most memorable campaigns of the past 5 years, all while maintaining complete anonymity until now." "Oh my God," whispered one of Colette's friends. "I've seen these campaigns. I remember that perfume ad from last year, the one everyone was talking about." "That was you." I nodded again, feeling surreal about the whole situation. For 5 years, I'd kept this part of my life completely separate from my family, partly out of self-protection and partly because I never imagined they would understand or appreciate what I was doing. Now, watching their faces cycle through shock, confusion, and what looked like the beginning of respect, I realized I might have underestimated them. Well, most of them. "This is absolutely insane," Colette said, her voice rising slightly. "Elle, you can't just pretend to be some famous model. This is my engagement dinner, not some elaborate prank." The accusation hung in the air like a slap. Even after seeing the proof, even with multiple sources confirming the story, Colette's first instinct was to assume I was lying, trying to steal her spotlight. Sebastian, who had been watching the chaos unfold with what looked like fascination, stepped in smoothly. "She's not pretending," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "I recognized her the moment she walked in, but I couldn't place where I'd seen her face. Now I remember, my company invested in the campaign she directed for Morrison Industries last year, the one that increased our brand recognition by 30%. The room went quiet again as everyone absorbed this information. Sebastian wasn't just confirming my identity, he was revealing that he'd been professionally connected to my work without either of us realizing it. "You invested in Elle's campaign?" Colette's voice was barely audible. "Ivy Vale's campaign?" Sebastian corrected gently, though I suppose they're the same person. He looked at me with something that might have been admiration. It was brilliant work, understated, elegant, completely authentic, everything our marketing team had been trying to achieve for years. Harper had pulled up the full Vogue article on her phone and was reading intently. "Listen to this," she said. "Vale's approach to beauty challenges conventional standards by finding extraordinary moments in seemingly ordinary subjects. Her work suggests that true elegance comes not from perfection, but from the courage to be authentically oneself." I felt my cheeks burn as Harper read the quote. It was strange hearing my philosophy described so formally, especially in front of people who had spent years treating me like I had nothing interesting to say about anything. "There are dozens of articles about her work," Harper continued, scrolling rapidly. "Fashion magazines, industry publications. Elle, you're actually famous." "Infamous might be a better word," I said, trying to deflect some of the intensity of their attention. "Most of the time, people don't even know the model's name," but Uncle Robert was shaking his head. "This article says you've been the creative director on campaigns for Chanel, Dior, Tom Ford. Elle, these are huge brands. This isn't just modeling, you've been running the creative side of major fashion campaigns." The magnitude of what I'd achieved was finally starting to sink in for them. This wasn't just about pretty pictures or lucky breaks. I'd built a career based on my creative vision, my ability to see and create beauty in ways that resonated with people. Vivian, who had been conspicuously silent through most of the revelation, finally found her voice. "But how is this possible? We would have known if you were doing something like this." There was something almost petulant in her tone, as if I had deliberately deceived her by not living up to her expectations of my limitations. "I kept it private," I said simply. "I wanted to build something on my own terms, without complications. What I didn't say was that I'd kept it private because I needed to protect it from exactly this kind of scrutiny, From the family dynamic that had always made me feel like anything I achieved would somehow be diminished or explained away. But why? Harper asked, and her question seemed genuinely confused rather than accusatory. Why hide something so amazing? I glanced around the table at faces that were finally looking at me with something like respect, and I felt a pang of sadness for the years we'd lost, the relationships that might have been different if I'd been brave enough to be fully myself earlier. Because, I said carefully, I needed to know that what I was building was really mine. I needed to prove to myself that I could succeed without trading on family connections or explanations or expectations about who I was supposed to be. Sebastian was nodding slowly, and I could see understanding in his expression. You wanted to know that people valued your work for what it was, not because of who you were connected to. Exactly. Colette had been growing paler and more rigid throughout this entire exchange. Now she stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This is ridiculous, she said again, but her voice had a brittle quality that made everyone look at her with concern. Elle, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this is supposed to be about my engagement. This is my moment, and you're trying to ruin it with some elaborate fantasy about being a fashion model. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Even after seeing multiple sources confirm the story, even with Sebastian's professional testimony, Colette simply could not accept that her plain little sister had achieved something remarkable. Colette, Harper said gently, it's not a fantasy. Look at the photos. Read the articles. This is real. But Colette was beyond listening to reason. She grabbed her purse and stood up, her face flushed with anger and something that looked like panic. I need some air, she announced. This whole evening has been, I can't deal with this right now. She stalked toward the door, then paused and turned back to face the table. You know what? Fine. Congratulations. You've managed to turn my engagement dinner into your coming out party. I hope you're happy. And with that, she was gone, leaving behind a room full of people staring after her in shock. Vivian, looking mortified by her older daughter's behavior, gathered her things and hurried after Colette, throwing apologetic looks over her shoulder but not actually apologizing to me. The remaining guests sat in uncomfortable silence for a moment, processing what had just happened. Then, unexpectedly, Harper started to applaud. I think, she said clearly, that we should be celebrating Elle's amazing achievement instead of pretending it's somehow a problem. Julian joined in, then Uncle Robert, then Sebastian. One by one, the remaining guests began to clap, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. It wasn't the reaction I'd expected or even hoped for, but it felt genuine in a way that family approval had never felt before. You know what the most incredible part is? Sebastian said as the applause died down. Looking at these photos, reading about your work, this is who you've always been. We just never took the time to really see you. He was right. And that realization was both validating and heartbreaking. I hadn't become a different person, I'd simply finally found the courage to let people see who I really was. The girl who had taken photographs that captured beauty in unexpected places had grown up to become a woman who built her career on the same principle. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, many of them stopped to congratulate me or ask questions about my work. The conversations felt different from any family gathering I'd ever attended. They were talking to me, not around me, asking about my opinions and experiences instead of making assumptions about my limitations. Harper was the last to leave, lingering as I gathered my things. Elle, she said softly, I owe you an apology. We all do. I spent so many years following Colette around, agreeing with everything she said, that I never stopped to think about how we were treating you. You deserved so much better from all of us. I hugged her then, surprised by how much her words meant to me. Thank you for saying that. I mean it. And I want you to know I kept those photographs you took of me because they were the first pictures anyone had ever taken that made me feel beautiful without having to pose or perform. You saw something in me that I didn't even know was there. As I walked out of the Rosewood Hotel that night, I felt like I was leaving behind more than just a family dinner. I was leaving behind the version of myself that had spent 27 years apologizing for taking up space in the world. Tomorrow, everyone would know that Elvance and Ivy Vale were the same person, and I would have to figure out how to navigate a world where my two identities had finally merged. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of being seen. I was ready to stop disappearing. The fallout from the engagement dinner began before I even made it home that night. As I sat in the back of an Uber, watching the city lights blur past the window, my phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, everywhere I looked, people were sharing the Vogue story, tagging me, commenting on the transformation from invisible sister to successful model. But it wasn't all positive attention. By the time I reached my apartment in Brooklyn, Colette had already posted her response on social media. Nova was waiting for me with a cup of tea and a grimace. She didn't waste any time, Nova said, handing me her phone. The Instagram post was a masterclass in passive-aggressive manipulation, a beautifully filtered photo of Colette looking devastated with a caption that managed to paint herself as the victim while subtly destroying my credibility. Sometimes the people closest to you will do anything for attention, even if it means ruining the most important moments of your life. I'm heartbroken that my own sister chose tonight to reveal this elaborate fantasy. I just wanted one perfect evening to celebrate love with family, but I guess some people can't bear to let others shine. #heartbroken, #family drama, #truth hurts. The comments were already pouring in from her followers, people who knew nothing about our history but were ready to defend her against the jealous sister who had supposedly fabricated a modeling career to steal her thunder. Reading them felt like being punched in the stomach repeatedly. She's calling her career a fantasy, Nova said, her voice tight with anger. Even after everything that happened tonight. I scrolled through more comments, each one making me feel smaller. Attention seeking much? Imagine being so jealous of your sister's happiness that you'd lie about being a model. This is why some people shouldn't be invited to family events. Don't read anymore, Nova said, taking the phone away from me. These people don't know you. They don't know what really happened. But the damage was spreading beyond just Colette's followers. Someone had recorded part of the dinner conversation and posted it on TikTok with the caption, "Family drama at fancy restaurant, sister claims to be secret supermodel." The video was grainy and the audio was poor, but you could clearly hear Colette accusing me of lying and my quiet confirmation that yes, I was Ivy Vale. The comments on that video were even worse. People were analyzing my appearance, debating whether I was pretty enough to be a real model, speculating about plastic surgery and Photoshop. Some defended me, pointing to the legitimate press coverage and Sebastian's confirmation, but they were drowned out by the skeptics and trolls. I spent the next 3 days in a strange kind of limbo. Professionally, my phone was ringing constantly, interview requests, collaboration offers, brands wanting to work with the newly revealed Ivy Vale. But personally, I felt like I was under siege. Old high school classmates were sliding into my DMs with messages that ranged from congratulatory to suspicious. "Always knew you had it in you," mixed with "this seems fake." The I remember was super awkward. Former coworkers from my early jobs were giving interviews to gossip blogs, sharing unflattering stories about the weird, quiet girl who apparently had secret ambitions. The worst part was watching my family choose sides. Uncle Robert posted a supportive message on Facebook, sharing the Vogue article with a caption, "So proud of my incredibly talented niece." But Aunt Patricia liked several of Colette's posts, including one where she shared a throwback photo of us as teenagers with the caption, "Before some people forgot who they really were." Even my professional relationships were being affected. I had a scheduled meeting with a potential client who spent the first 20 minutes asking about the family situation instead of discussing the campaign we were supposed to be planning. "Look," the brand manager said, leaning back in her chair, "we love your work, we really do. But right now there's a lot of noise around your personal life. We need to make sure that's not going to overshadow the message we're trying to send." It was exactly what I'd feared would happen if my two worlds collided, my personal drama becoming more interesting to people than my actual work. Nova tried to keep my spirits up, reminding me that this was just the initial shock wave and that it would die down. But on Thursday morning, I woke up to find that someone had created a fake Instagram account using old photos of me from high school, posting them alongside recent Ivy Vale photos with captions like "You be the judge," "Same person," or "Elaborate scam." I was lying on my couch staring at the ceiling and wondering if I should have just stayed invisible forever when Harper called. "Elle, I need to tell you something," she said without preamble, "about Colette, about why she's reacting this way." I sat up, surprised to hear from her so soon after the dinner. "What do you mean? Do you remember David Patterson from college?" I did remember him, a sweet, artistic guy who had asked me out during one of the few family gatherings he'd attended. I'd been interested, but before anything could develop, he'd suddenly started dating Colette instead. "Colette told him you weren't interested," Harper continued. "She said you thought he was too weird, too artsy. She convinced him to ask her out instead, and then she dated him for 3 months before getting bored and dumping him." I felt like the air had been knocked out of my lungs. "She what?" "She's done it before, Elle. Anytime a guy showed interest in you, and there were more than you knew about, she'd find a way to redirect that attention to herself. She couldn't stand the idea that someone might choose you over her." The revelation reframed so many memories, so many moments when I'd wondered why guys who seemed interested would suddenly start avoiding me or would show up at family events as Colette's dates instead. It wasn't that I'd been invisible, it was that my sister had been actively working to keep me that way. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Because I'm tired of being complicit," Harper said. "I'm tired of watching her tear you down to build herself up. And because I think you deserve to know that your instincts about people being interested in you were right. She just made sure you never got to find out." After Harper hung up, I felt something shift inside me. The hurt was still there, but underneath it was a growing anger, not just about the modeling career revelation, but about years of systematic undermining that I was only now beginning to understand. When Sebastian called that evening, I almost didn't answer. Part of me assumed he was calling to smooth things over with Colette, maybe to ask me to downplay the whole situation for the sake of their relationship. "Elle," he said when I finally picked up, "I need to see you. Can we meet somewhere private?" We met at a small coffee shop in the village, far from anywhere we might run into family or society photographers. Sebastian looked tired, like he hadn't been sleeping well, and there was something different in his manner, less polished, more uncertain. "I called off the engagement," he said without preamble. I nearly choked on my coffee. "You what?" "This morning. I couldn't do it, Elle. These past few days have shown me things about Colette that I can't unsee. The way she's trying to destroy your reputation, the way she's mobilizing people against you. That's not the woman I thought I was marrying." I stared at him in shock. "Sebastian, you don't have to do this because of me. What happened at the dinner wasn't about you and Colette, wasn't it?" he finished. He leaned forward, his expression intense. "Elle, I've been watching your career for 2 years without knowing it was you, your campaigns, your creative direction. That work spoke to me in a way that nothing Colette ever said or did has. And when I realized you were the same person who's been sitting quietly in the background at family events, letting everyone treat you like you were invisible." He ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling with how to articulate what he was feeling. "I kept thinking about what you said that night about needing to prove you could build something that was really yours. That takes incredible strength, Elle. And then I watched Colette try to tear it all down rather than celebrate your success. And I realized I don't actually know the woman I was planning to marry." The conversation felt surreal. 3 days ago, Sebastian had been my sister's fiancé, someone I barely knew beyond polite family interaction. Now he was telling me that my work had influenced his feelings about his relationship, that seeing how my family treated me had opened his eyes to something fundamental about Colette's character. "I don't know what to say," I admitted. "You don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to know that someone sees what you've accomplished and that watching you handle all this criticism with such grace has been inspiring." As I walked home that night, I felt like the ground had shifted beneath my feet again. Colette's engagement was over, at least partly because of what had happened at the dinner. I should have felt vindicated, but instead I felt exhausted. All I'd wanted was to build a life where I could be valued for who I really was. I never intended to destroy anyone else's happiness in the process. But then I remembered Harper's revelation about David and all the other times Colette had actively worked to diminish me. Maybe this wasn't about my actions at all. Maybe this was about the natural consequences of treating people badly finally catching up with her. The Vogue feature came out in print the following week, and with it came a level of professional recognition that I'd never experienced before. The magazine had done a full spread, 6 pages of photographs and an in-depth interview about my philosophy on beauty, my creative process, and my journey from anonymous model to creative director. But more than the prestige of the magazine placement, what moved me were the responses from readers. My Instagram, which I'd finally made public under my real name, was flooded with messages from young women who said my story had inspired them to pursue their own creative dreams despite family skepticism or societal pressure. "I've been hiding my art for years because my family says it's not practical," wrote one teenager. "Seeing your success makes me want to be brave enough to show the world what I can do." Another message read, "I always felt too plain to model, but your campaign made me realize that beauty isn't about fitting into someone else's idea of perfect. Thank you for showing us that there are different ways to be beautiful." These responses reminded me why I'd been drawn to this work in the first place: the power of representation, of showing people that there was space in the world for different kinds of beauty, different ways of being seen. Nova suggested we celebrate with dinner at our favorite restaurant, but I found myself craving something bigger. "What if we threw a party?" I said, not for the press or the industry people, but for everyone who supported me along the way, the photographers who took chances on an unknown model, the assistants who became friends, the clients who trusted my vision. The party ended up being held at a gallery space in Tribeca that one of my photographer friends offered to let us use. We kept it intimate, maybe 50 people, but it felt like the most authentic celebration I'd ever been part of. People were there because they genuinely cared about me or my work, not because of social obligation or networking opportunities. Julian showed up, having driven in from New Jersey where he lived with his family. "I had to come," he said when I expressed surprise at seeing him. "I wanted to congratulate you properly and to apologize for not seeing who you really were when we were younger." We talked for a long time that night about the people we'd been in high school and the people we'd become. There was something healing about having someone from my past acknowledge that I'd always been more than the role my family had assigned me. "You know," he said as the evening was winding down, "I keep thinking about what might have been different if I'd been brave enough to really see you back then." It was a sweet sentiment, but I realized I didn't feel any regret about the path my life had taken. If Julian had noticed me in high school, if my family had supported my creativity from the beginning, I might never have developed the independence and strength that had allowed me to build my career on my own terms. "I think everything happened exactly the way it needed to," I told him. A few days after the party, I was offered the opportunity to creative direct a major campaign for a luxury brand that specialized in what they called elevated basics, simple, well-made pieces designed to make the wearer feel confident without having to perform glamour. It was exactly the kind of project I'd been dreaming of, a chance to apply my aesthetic on a larger scale. The campaign concept was quiet confidence, photographs of women in various stages of their lives, all wearing the brand's clothes in ways that felt natural and unposed. We shot in real locations rather than studios: a woman reading in a bookstore, another walking her dog in the early morning light, a grandmother teaching her granddaughter to bake. It was some of the most fulfilling work I'd ever done, partly because I felt like I was finally able to use my visibility to platform the kind of beauty I'd always believed in. These weren't traditional models, they were women whose faces told stories, whose confidence came from lived experience rather than genetic lottery. While I was immersed in the campaign, Colette's life was unraveling in a much more public way. Without Sebastian's stabilizing presence and financial support, she seemed to be struggling to maintain the lifestyle she'd built her identity around. Her social media posts became increasingly desperate: designer goods for sale, sponsored content for questionable products, attention-seeking captions that made her followers uncomfortable. I felt sorry for her. Honestly, watching someone who had defined herself entirely through external validation lose the sources of that validation was genuinely painful, even given our history. She reached out to me through a mutual cousin, asking if we could meet for coffee to clear the air. Part of me was curious to hear what she had to say, but a bigger part of me recognized that I didn't owe her my emotional energy anymore. I declined the meeting but sent a message through Harper: "I wish Colette well and I hope she finds whatever she's looking for. but I'm not available for conversations that are likely to be attempts to pull me back into old patterns. It felt strange to set that boundary so clearly, but also liberating. For the first time in my life, I was prioritizing my own emotional well-being over my family's expectations about forgiveness and reconciliation. The Quiet Confidence campaign launched 3 months later to widespread acclaim. Fashion magazines praised its authenticity, marketing publications analyzed its effectiveness, and most importantly, sales for the brand increased significantly. But what meant the most to me were the personal messages I received from women who said the campaign had made them feel seen. One email in particular stayed with me. "I'm 63 years old and I've spent my whole life feeling invisible. Your campaign made me realize that there's beauty in who I am right now, not just in who I used to be or who I think I should become. Thank you for giving women like me permission to be proud of ourselves exactly as we are." Reading that message, I understood that the work I was doing had grown beyond personal success or professional achievement. It had become about using my platform to expand the conversation about what it meant to be worth looking at, worth celebrating, worth seeing. I started getting invited to speak at conferences and universities about creativity, authenticity, and building a career on your own terms. These speaking engagements terrified me at first. The idea of being the center of attention still triggered all my old instincts to hide. But I found that when I was talking about work I cared about, the confidence came naturally. At one particularly memorable event at a design school, a student asked me about dealing with family members who don't support your creative ambitions. "Sometimes," I said, "the people who are supposed to love us the most are the ones who have the hardest time accepting when we outgrow the roles they've assigned us. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with your growth. It just means they need time to adjust their understanding of who you are." After the talk, several students approached me with their own stories of family members who had dismissed their artistic aspirations or questioned their decision to pursue creative careers. I found myself becoming an accidental mentor to young people who were navigating the same tension between family expectations and personal authenticity that I'd struggled with for years. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd spent my childhood feeling invisible only to build a career that was fundamentally about making other people feel seen. But maybe that's how healing works. We learn to give others what we needed most ourselves. A year after the engagement dinner that changed everything, I found myself standing in the empty house where I'd grown up. Vivian had finally decided to sell the family home, and she'd asked me to come by to collect anything I wanted to keep before the estate sale. Walking through those rooms felt like traveling through time. Here was the kitchen where I'd learned to make myself invisible during family gatherings. Here was the living room where Colette had performed for adults while I faded into the background. Here was my childhood bedroom, still painted the pale yellow that Vivian had chosen because it was neutral, suitable for a daughter who wasn't expected to have strong opinions about anything. I found myself in Dad's old office, a room that had remained largely untouched since his death 5 years earlier. His books were still on the shelves, his coffee mug still sat on the desk, and tucked into the corner was the portfolio of photographs I'd taken as a teenager, the ones that had made Colette uncomfortable and that Mom had dismissed as too serious. Looking through those images now, I could see the seeds of everything I'd become. Even at 15, I'd been drawn to moments of quiet beauty, to capturing people when they thought no one was watching, to finding the extraordinary in the seemingly ordinary. My aesthetic hadn't changed, I had just finally found the courage to trust it. I sat down at Dad's desk and wrote a letter to my younger self. "Dear 15-year-old Elle, I know you feel invisible right now. I know you think that's because there's something wrong with you, something lacking or broken that makes you unworthy of attention. I'm writing to tell you that you're wrong about that. Your quietness isn't a defect, it's a superpower. Your ability to observe without needing to be observed is rare and valuable. Your instinct to find beauty in unexpected places will become the foundation of a career that brings you more fulfillment than you can imagine. The people who make you feel small right now are operating from their own fears and limitations. Their inability to see your worth says nothing about your actual value. Trust yourself. Trust your vision. Trust that the world needs exactly what you have to offer. Even if your family can't see it yet, one day you'll walk into a room full of people and instead of shrinking back, you'll stand tall, not because you've become someone else, but because you've finally learned to be fully yourself. don't disappear. The world is waiting for you. Love, the woman you become. I folded the letter and slipped it into the portfolio, then packed both to take home with me. As I was loading boxes into my car, Harper appeared in the driveway. We'd stayed in touch regularly since the engagement dinner, and she'd become something like the sister I'd always wanted, someone who saw me clearly and celebrated my successes without feeling threatened by them. "Taking the good stuff?" she asked, helping me lift a particularly heavy box. "Just some photos and Dad's books," I said. "Not much I need from this place anymore. How are you feeling about all this?" She gestured toward the house. "End of an era and all that." I considered her question seriously. A year ago, the thought of my childhood home being sold would have felt like losing the last connection to a version of my family that had never quite existed. Now it felt more like closing a chapter that had already ended. "Peaceful," I said finally. "It feels right." We drove together to Nova's engagement party. She was marrying her partner Carmen in a ceremony that would be everything a wedding should be: joyful, authentic, celebratory of who they actually were rather than who they thought they should be. I was honored to be Nova's maid of honor, and I'd been working on my speech for weeks. The party was held in the back garden of a restaurant in Park Slope with string lights and wildflowers and the kind of effortless elegance that came from focusing on joy rather than perfection. As I stood up to give my toast, looking out at the faces of people who had supported Nova and Carmen's relationship from the beginning, I felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the chosen family I'd built. "Nova," I began, "you taught me something important when we first became friends. You showed me that love isn't about making yourself smaller so someone else can feel bigger. It's about celebrating each other's growth, supporting each other's dreams, and creating space for each other to be fully, authentically yourselves." I paused, looking at Nova's beaming face, then continued, "You've shown me what real love looks like, the kind that sees you clearly and chooses you anyway, the kind that makes you braver and kinder and more yourself than you ever thought possible. Carmen, thank you for loving my best friend with the kind of fierce devotion she deserves. And thank you both for showing all of us that the best relationships are built on truth, not performance." The applause was warm and genuine, and as I sat back down, I felt Nova squeeze my hand. "That was perfect," she whispered. Later that evening, as the party was winding down, Sebastian appeared at my table. We'd stayed in touch sporadically over the past year, professional correspondence mostly, with the occasional friendly check-in. He looked good, more relaxed than I'd ever seen him, like he'd been released from some obligation he hadn't realized was weighing him down. "Congratulations on the campaign," he said, referring to my latest project that had just launched. "I saw the billboard in Times Square. It's incredible work." "Thank you. How are you doing?" "Really?" He smiled, and it was the first completely unguarded expression I'd ever seen from him. "I'm good. Really good." It turns out that ending an engagement that was wrong for both of us was one of the best decisions I've ever made. We talked for a while about work, about life, about the strange turns both our lives had taken since that dinner a year ago. There was an ease between us that felt new, the comfort of two people who had been through something difficult together and come out the other side intact. He said as the evening was ending, "I want you to know that meeting you, seeing how you handled everything that happened, it changed something fundamental about how I think about authenticity and courage. Thank you for that." I felt a warm glow at his words, but also a clarity about what this relationship was and wasn't. Sebastian was a good man who had learned important lessons about himself through our strange intersection. But I didn't need him to complete my story or validate my worth. I'd learned to do that for myself. A few weeks later, I received an unexpected message from Colette, not through intermediaries this time, but directly, a simple text that read, "I saw your interview in Harper's Bazaar. I'm proud of you." I stared at the message for a long time, trying to decide how to respond. The interview she was referring to had been about overcoming family dynamics that limit your potential, and I'd been honest about our relationship without being deliberately hurtful. I'd talked about the importance of setting boundaries with people who couldn't celebrate your success, about learning to validate yourself when external validation was withheld. In the end, I wrote back, "Thank you. I hope you're well." It wasn't forgiveness exactly, and it wasn't an invitation to rebuild our relationship, but it was acknowledgement of her message, of the shared history we couldn't change, of the possibility that people could grow and change if they chose to. I never heard back from her, and that was okay too. The following month, I was invited to give a keynote speech at a conference about women in creative industries. Standing on that stage, looking out at an audience of hundreds of women who were building their own careers and fighting their own battles for recognition, I felt the full weight of how far I'd traveled from that invisible girl at family dinners. You don't need permission to take up space, I told them. You don't need anyone else's validation to know that your voice matters, that your vision has value, that your perspective deserves to be heard. The world is waiting for what only you can offer, but you have to be brave enough to offer it. After the speech, a young woman approached me with tears in her eyes. I've been hiding my photography for 3 years because my family says it's not a real career, she said. But listening to you, I think I'm ready to stop hiding. Driving home that night, I thought about the girl I'd been at her age, so certain that invisibility was safer than visibility, so convinced that staying small was the only way to avoid disappointment. I wished I could go back and tell her what I knew now, that being seen was scary, but being unseen was scarier, that validation from people who didn't really know you was worthless compared to the deep satisfaction of being truly known and valued for who you actually were. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car for a moment, looking up at the windows of the home I'd built with Nova, thinking about the life I'd created entirely on my own terms. Tomorrow, I would wake up and continue the work I loved, surrounded by people who saw and celebrated the real me. I would use my voice to platform other people who deserved to be seen. I would continue becoming more fully myself with each passing day. Standing in front of my bathroom mirror that night, removing the makeup I'd worn for the conference, I looked at my face, the face that had appeared on billboards and magazine covers, but more importantly, the face that belonged to a woman who had learned to value herself correctly. You are always enough, I said to my reflection. And for the first time in my life, I completely believed it. What would you discover about yourself if you stopped believing other people's stories about who you're supposed to be?